There is a Texas singer and songwriter by the name of Robert O'Keefe. Is anyone familiar with him? In one of the songs, he talks about how he had a rodeo career that lasted for about 3 seconds. He says, I don't know if you guys ever ridden a bull before, but it's kind of like driving down the highway at 55 miles an hour and taking the steering wheel and just throwing it out the window. I feel like that's kind of where we are right now. But don't worry, I promise, we'll get that steering wheel back in the window. So today, in the scripture, Jesus talks about two things that are pretty vital to the life of a follower of Jesus. Jesus talks about reconciliation and forgiveness. To begin with, Jesus talks to his would-be followers of Jesus and his disciples of Jesus, and presumably to us, about this concept of reconciliation and how it works. He begins by instructing those around him, saying, if a member of the church sins against you or offends you, you need to go and confront them directly. Do it in private, just the two of you. Do it in private, that way no one gets embarrassed out in public. And then Jesus says, if that member... Harrison, we got my microphone turned on?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Is that good? Then Jesus says that if that member listens to you, great, good. Everything's taken care of. But if not, then get 2 or 3 other members of the church to go with you to this member and confront them about how they have offended you. And again, if this person who has offended you listens to what you have to say, great, it's all good, everything's taken care of. But if not, then you really got to ratchet things up. You need to bring the person and the issue of the offense before the entire congregation. Now, this is not the same thing as making it public to the world, but bringing it before the congregation. And if the member listens to you and the witnesses and the congregation, great and good. But if not, let that one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Now, traditionally in the church, we've heard that phrase and thought we have no idea what that means. But we think of Gentiles and tax collectors, and we tend to traditionally interpret that as Jesus saying, if that person won't listen to you, the witnesses, and the congregation, just let them be. Just cut them off. Next, we talk about forgiveness. Because Peter, picking up this reconciliation theme, says, Lord, how many times must we forgive someone who has offended us? 7 times? Peter's always so eager to get everything right. Unfortunately, he hardly ever does, but he tries. And Jesus says, no, 77 times, or 70 times 7 times. That's an idiomatic phrase that pretty much means infinity plus 1 time. You got it? So Jesus is saying you must forgive them as many times as is humanly impossible to forgive them. Jesus is kind of exaggerating here to prove a point about how important it is to forgive those who have sinned against us. And then comes a parable. Jesus says the empire of God is like, or may be compared to. And this parable is about forgiveness. Because there's a king, Jesus tells us about, who is trying to collect on all the debts that are owed to him. And he finds this one slave or servant who owes him an insurmountable debt. More debt than this servant can pay. And so to recoup his losses, the king decides to sell the slave, to sell the slave's wife, to sell the slave's kids, and all of his possessions, in an attempt to get some of that money back that is gone. The slave pleads for mercy. The king grants mercy. Wipes away the entire debt. Upon leaving that place, the slave, the servant, runs into another slave or servant who owes him a much smaller debt that cannot be paid. And so the slave who has just been forgiven the insurmountable debt demands the much smaller debt from the other slave. And when the other slave can't pay that debt, the other slave pleads for mercy and forgiveness. But the debt is not forgiven. And the slave who has been forgiven so much has the other slave sent to prison until the debt can be paid. Now the king hears about this and summons the forgiven slave back and gives him a severe tongue lashing that leads to pretty much the revoking of his forgiveness. And that slave is now sent to prison to be tortured until the debt is paid in full. And Jesus says, so will my heavenly Father do to any of you who do not forgive brother and sister from your heart. Traditionally, we look at this parable and we see this as the eternal effects of what happens if we do not practice forgiveness, as it has been shown to us. So, the church looks at this passage, and traditionally in these ways, we hear the words that Jesus speaks to us about reconciliation and forgiveness. Like I said, that's the traditional interpretation of how these is. What about a not so traditional, maybe an alternative or not so typical, an atypical understanding of these passages? Bear with me for a minute as we talk about reconciliation. So again, Jesus talks to his disciples, to his followers, to those who would follow him, about how we reconcile to members of the church who have offended you. Now, for the record, I want to say that Jesus' advice here is outstanding. This is exactly what you have to do. When someone who has offended you, it is important to go and talk to that person and let them know that they have offended you and deal with the situation while you can. Because if not, they can fester, and have terrible results. Does anybody remember the sitcom Everybody Loves Raymond? Yeah? So you had Deborah and Raymond and their kids. They lived next door to Raymond's parents, Marie and Frank. And in one episode, there's a piece of luggage that is sitting on the stairs. Raymond thinks that Deborah should put away the luggage. Deborah thinks that Raymond should put away the luggage. And for a month, neither of them put away the luggage, and neither of them talk about it. It becomes this incredibly passive-aggressive fight about whose responsibility it is to put up this luggage. One day, Marie walks into it and figures out what's going on, and she says, Deborah, I want you to come with me. And she takes Deborah next door into her kitchen. And she points to some objects on the wall. And she says, do you see what's on the wall there? And there on the wall are these giant wooden utensils, a fork and a spoon. And she says, we got those 45 years ago as a wedding present. And we hate them. We hated them then, we wanted to get rid of them. There's no nuance to them. They were a gift from Frank's aunt, and so Marie thought that it was Frank's responsibility to return the presents. Frank thought that since they were utensils and in the kitchen, they were the woman's responsibility, and she should return the presents. And she said that they sat there on the table for months, until finally it blew up to a huge argument. That was their first big argument. And finally she left saying, I'm going to my mother's house, and when I come back, you better be the only ugly thing in this house. She came back, and Frank has taken the wooden spoon and nailed it to the wall. So Marie takes the wooden fork and she nails it to the wall, but a little bit higher to prove that she was right. They never resolve the fight. Neither of them can take it down. Neither of them can console or confront the other. And that wooden spoon and fork, the big fork and spoon as they call it, remain there as a reminder of that constant fight that was never solved and that nobody won. So she says to Deborah, it's not worth it. At the end of the episode, Marie decides she's going to be the bigger person, and she goes to Frank, like sitting at the kitchen table, and says, I'm going to take down the big fork and spoon after 45 years. And she goes and she takes them down off the wall, and there on the wall is the outline of the big fork and spoon. If we do not deal with issues when they arise, even when we do deal with them later, it can have damaging, lasting results. So Jesus says, deal with the issue. Go to this brother or sister and confront them directly about what has happened. If they won't listen to you, bring some friends along. Bring other members of the church. This is important not so that the person who is being confronted feels like they're being ganged up on, but so that they know there are bystanders and witnesses to what has happened. If there are neutral witnesses to what goes on in that confrontation, there's no he said, she said. There are other people who know exactly what was said. So this protects both parties. And if that doesn't resolve it, then you bring the whole thing in front of the congregation. Again, you're not publicly airing it out. You're bringing it before the family in the church. Church, little c, local, not big C, universal. And if that one does not listen to you still, let them be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. And like I said, typically the church has looked at this and thought this to mean, just let them go. And we think that because in that day and age in the Jewish community, Gentiles and tax collectors were pretty much shunned or kept at arm's distance. Nobody really liked being around them, except for one person, Jesus. Already in the gospel, he has been criticized twice by his opponents for having fellowship, for being with Gentiles and tax collectors. So if Jesus is saying that this one is to be treated like a Gentile and a tax collector, and Jesus treats Gentiles and tax collectors as those who are welcomed into his life, what if Jesus is not saying let them go, but to bring them closer in, to continue to welcome them in the life of the church? Now, if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. Because remember, this only happens after they have been confronted privately, after it has been witnessed by other members of the church, and after it has been brought before the entire congregation. Suddenly, everyone in the family is part of holding this individual accountable. And if we continue to welcome them into the family, then maybe eventually, someday, that accountability of the congregation will change their attitude, will change their actions, will change their heart. So, a less than typical understanding of what reconciliation means. And what about the parable? Like I said, typically when we hear this parable, we think it is God who is the king, and us who are the servants. That's typically what we understand it to mean. But remember, this is a parable. A parable is not a tit for tat, substitute A for B. It is not exactly what this is. Jesus doesn't say the kingdom of heaven is. Jesus says the kingdom or the empire of God is like or may be compared to a king. We have typically interpreted this parable to be about our eternal salvation and what happens if we do not practice forgiveness. But what if it's not? About what happens far from here? What if it's about forgiveness in the here and the now? So what if the king in this parable is not God? And what if the servant in the parable is not necessarily us? Think about what happens. There's a servant that comes to the king, owing the king 10,000, is it talents? 10,000 talents. Do you know how much that is? 1 talent is equal to 15 years of labor. That's how much a person can earn in 15 years, 1 talent. Somehow, this guy has run up a debt that would take 600 years to pay off. And he ain't Methuselah. This is an insurmountable debt. Jesus is exaggerating, yet again, to make a point. This guy cannot imagine running up this debt, cannot imagine paying this debt. And do you really think there would be a king who would allow such a debt to be given? Who would allow the entire gross national product of another country to be laid upon one human being? And do you really think that that king would then just miraculously forgive that debt? And then do you really think that someone who has experienced that amazing amount of grace wouldn't have an iota of forgiveness for someone else? And then when hearing about that, would that king then take away the forgiveness and make that person be tortured until they can pay the debt? Which will be never, because if you're busy being tortured, you're not busy earning any money. Jesus is using what we call hyperbole. Jesus is exaggerating to make a point. Remember, forgive them 70 times, 7 times, when Jesus was exaggerating to make a point. What if Jesus in this parable is exaggerating to make a point? What if Jesus is talking about the effects of forgiveness, not for eternity, but in the here and now? Being forgiven should affect the way we live, to the point that we should forgive others. And if not, then it is serious business. There's that bit at the end about, so will my Father do to you, if any of you do not forgive a brother or sister from the heart. Jesus is exaggerating to make a point. if you do not forgive, you will deal with the consequences. So what if that's a way of looking at this parable? So this passage is about reconciliation and forgiveness. There's the typical understanding about how these things work, and there's a not so typical understanding about how these things work. And whichever one you agree with, that's fine and dandy. Just remember that Jesus is telling us Jesus followers, that we need to practice reconciliation and forgiveness. It is incredibly important. It is incredibly difficult because it can change the world. No matter how you understand Jesus' instructions about that Gentile and tax collector, or how you understand or interpret that thing about how the empire of God is like, what we must remember is that Jesus tells his followers, us, who have already been told that we must take up our cross and follow him, that no matter how hard it is, we must practice reconciliation and forgiveness. If we don't, there are serious consequences. And if we do, in the name of God, we will change